Hi everyone, Dead Battery here, and thank you for joining me on my channel. Today's video is going to be on the Sega Mark III. Now, the Sega Mark III was the successor to the SG-1002, which was a redesign of the SG-1000. The Sega Mark III was released on October 20th in 1985. It was originally only released in Japan, but later on it was released in Taiwan because they had the SG-1002. And then it was also released in South Korea in November of 1988. And it was actually the first Sega console that was released in South Korea, and they expected to sell 50,000 units, however that didn't happen. When the Sega Mark III was released, Famicom was still technically its competition, and it did a lot better, but it still could not beat out Nintendo. Even though it was released as having a cartridge slot as well as a card slot, they actually didn't release any games with it. They actually went with the cheaper cost to make something, so they went with the Sega cards versus producing cartridges. Now later on, they did make more games, but at the time of release, they didn't make any for the system. And in its first year, it did sell 1 million consoles. So this is one of my junk section finds. I did find it without anything attached to it. So basically the tag says, we can't test it, so we don't know if it works. I thought it looked like it was in fairly good condition. I thought it'd be a good idea to get it. And I wanted to see what some of the cartridge games were because I've seen them out and about and just haven't actually bought any since I didn't have anything to run it on. Since I didn't know what condition it would really be in, I did test it to make sure it powered on, and it did power on, but it's always a good thing to do a capacitor swap, so I thought might as well. So let's open up the Sega Mark III, let's swap out the capacitors, and then let's get this game system running. So many of you know about the Sega system, except you know about it as the Master System. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that because I would like to eventually buy a Master System and do another video on it. As mentioned, the system does have a cartridge slot at the top, and then in the front is where the Sega cards slide in. To open up the Sega, all you need is a Phillips head screwdriver, and there are 6 screws on the back. I didn't see a difference in them, so you shouldn't have to worry about where they go back to. I did have a little difficulty getting the top off. It seemed to be really stuck together in place, but with a little wiggling, it eventually opened up. And do not just pull it right off, but there's another section attached to the top as well as the reset button wires. And there definitely looks like it might have broken and somebody put it back together, or maybe they just all come like this. I don't know, but we'll definitely have to replace those wires. The next part was a little tricky. I had to get the card reader slot off the top, and it's just 2 Phillips head screws, but the angle that you have to kind of get everything in can be difficult, so just be careful. I was going to attempt to take the motherboard out first before I did the reset button because it was just held down by 2 pressure points. It was harder than I thought to move that plastic, and I'd be real worried if that would break, so just be careful if you're doing this. Since it seemed like the motherboard was held down a little bit more than I originally thought, I decided to do the reset button. And this took me a lot longer than I would like to admit to get it off of the top shell. I kept turning it and turning it and spinning it and spinning it, hoping that it would release, which it would have if I would have thought to pull at the top of it. So the top black button just pops on and off. So once I popped that off, then the rest of it came apart. Since the motherboard was still in place, I also assumed these screws on the side of the cartridge reader needed to be removed, so I did unscrew those, and it's only 2 Phillips head again. Now there's just 1 more plastic pressure point in the back here, and the motherboard will come out. There is a plate covering part of the motherboard, and there is a capacitor underneath, so I'm going to remove it, and it's just the screw with the nut at the end, so just unscrew it as best you can, and then if you flip it over, you can use another head on your screwdriver if you want, but I just kind of put my tweezers in there and moved it until it came off. There are 2 of them. I didn't see a difference in the screws or the nuts, so you should be good putting those back once you're done. Now that the plate's out of the way, I can see all the capacitors that I need to get to. So before I do the capacitors, I am going to remove the reset button because I am going to replace the wires. So basically what I did to make sure I got all the capacitors out was I did hold it up to the light a little bit to see where my flux was, to make sure they were in the correct spots. I just went across with my desolder gun and got all the capacitors off the motherboard. So now that all the capacitors are off the board and everything is wiped down, I can go through and put all the capacitors back in their places. Once again, Console 5 does have a wiki page for this one, and it has all the capacitor numbers and what capacitors go there. And this one was pretty easy. There was only like 4 different types of capacitors, so as long as you knew where they went, you were good to go. And the board also has a plus sign on one side of the circle, so it was easy to know that you were putting the capacitor incorrectly. There is one more capacitor at the top of the My card, so do not forget to put that one in. Now that all the capacitors in, I can flip the board back over, I can put some flux down, and then I can go through and solder down all the legs. And I try to go from one side of the board to the other so that I get them all. And I do think that if you have a lot more where there's a lot more legs intersecting, it might be easier to do it in sections, because then you can't get in between the legs to solder down other legs. And I have mistakenly done that and had to solder down a couple, cut the legs off, and then solder down the rest. Now that we've put all brand new capacitors on, I can put this metal plate back on the top. It just slides underneath this one area, and then it's just the screws with the nuts on the other side. Now my next step is getting some new wire soldered down for this reset button. I used 22 gauge wire. I didn't really know if it mattered, but I certainly didn't want to use anything too thin in case it would break again. So I basically just held a solder wick up to it to suck off all the solder that was there, and the wires came off pretty easily. There was one wire that was a little bit longer, so I made sure when I cut my wires, I kept one slightly longer. Once the old wires are off, I put the new wires on and I kind of twist them a little bit, and then I just go back over them with soldering. I was debating if I wanted to solder it into place or put the reset button back on, and I went with putting the reset button back on just so that everything would stay in one spot. So the wires went to this one little line of pins. I believe it was the 5th or 6th one. If you do this, just take a picture so you remember where it goes. And then there was another pad at the bottom. So I just put some flux down and just put them back into place. And I made sure that the wire that was touching the pin wasn't touching any of the other pins around it. Now that the wires are soldered back into place, I can put the motherboard back down. And to get it back into place, you just line it up and give it a little bit of a push down, and the plastic pieces will move out of the way and clip to where they go to the motherboard. And then don't forget about the 2 screws that go around the cartridge slot. The hardest part was finding a good angle to get my hand and the screwdriver in here to get the card reader motherboard back to the top of the case. So just know if you're doing this can be a little difficult, and just make sure you give yourself enough room so that you're not moving anything more and accidentally breaking something. Once that's screwed to the top, I can close it up. And I did have this black cover. I didn't know what it was because it just kind of like fell out when I was taking it apart. But I realized it when I opened the cartridge slot that it perfectly matched the shape. So I went back, opened it, put it back down, and then closed it back up. And you can see inside then that you can't see the motherboard below it. Now I can flip it back over and put all 6 screws back in place. and then I can put this cover back on. And if you know what this is for, let me know. I thought I saw it attached to another Sega system, but I couldn't see the picture clear enough to find out what it was. And then these are the games that I bought for it, and we'll go downstairs and test it. We might not be able to test them all because I was not able to find a working controller for this system. I am still on the look for it. So what did you think about the Sega Mark III? I really like the look of the games, and I'm really excited to play some Choplifter. If you guys don't know, Choplifter is a fabulous game, and I know my friend Retrogamer X absolutely loves using that game in some of his test videos. I'll leave a link in the description below to his YouTube channel, but if you enjoy history of game systems or enjoy watching somebody play some of the games for him, he is definitely an awesome watch. I absolutely love how detailed he gets in his history. So hopefully I can get some Choplifter going. And I definitely like this system, and I'm definitely going to keep this one. I just need to find a controller for it. I reached out to some of my friends who are local, and so far nobody has a controller for it. I did, however, find a little connector that goes from the system to a different Sega controller, and I do own that controller. So I'm hoping that it comes in the mail soon so I can definitely give some of these games a try. I'm also thinking that maybe every other weekend that I'm not doing one of these videos, maybe me and my husband can sit down and play some of these games that we have piling up for all these game systems. So let me know in the comments if that's something you're interested in, and what game system should we start with first. In the end, this was a lot of fun. I'm excited to play some games for this, and I'm excited to see what other games I can find. Let me know in the comments if you have one of these consoles and what your favorite game is for it, and I'll have a look around. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you again in 2 weeks. Bye!